Welcome to the 7th video in the series on detective fiction from the University of Greenwich English programme. The video is associated with the third year course Literature and Publishing, which is a core course for English literature students and an option for others on some other degree programmes. It's from the part of the Literature and Publishing course concerned with the history of detective fiction. We started with 3 videos on Edgar Allan Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue, followed by another 3 on the 1864 sensation novel Henry Dunbar by Mary Elizabeth Braddon, and this video continues that. This video lecture in the series follows closely on the previous 3. Not only is it the 4th video in Henry Dunbar, but it continues the investigation that the 3rd video had started on what is now a much quoted, even notorious denunciation of sensation fiction by an Oxford Don, Henry Longueville Mansel. The previous video covered sensation sermons, spasmodic poetry, the circulating libraries, and penny periodicals. As I promised at the end of that previous video, this one will cover 2 more topics. First, the relation of railways to sensation fiction, and then something that Mansel doesn't mention, but which I think is very important and very revealing: sensation drama. The video that follows this one will ask to what extent a charge brought by Mansel against sensation fiction is true, whether it's what we might call today formulaic. I'll also explore the evidence for the importance of what Mansel calls proximity and personalities. First, though, let's think about railway bookstores. Of course, before you have railway bookstores, you have to have Now, the first truly commercial railway opened in 1830. It was the Liverpool-Manchester line, and over the next 30 years, the rail network reached further and further, became denser and denser, altering the lives of people in Britain forever, and coming to centre on London, as it still does. The development of trains and the spread of the rail network from the 1830s reminds us that distribution's important. In other words, how books and periodicals get to us, consumers. The railways not only sped up distribution, but also enabled an incredible increase in the quantity of goods that could be shifted. It was all very well for publishers to be able to produce large numbers of newspapers, magazines, and books with the high-tech, steam-driven printing presses that had been around since the second decade of the 19th century, but publishers had to get those newspapers, magazines, and books to their consumers, or at least to the point of sale. There was a decided limit on how much men and boys and horses could carry. The railways smashed the limits, and that enabled the huge increase in quantity of printed matter. Look at the length of the train here compared to that of the carriages. But there wasn't only a shift in the technology of distribution, there was a different social organization of print as well. This was caused, of course, by changes in distribution practices, but also in changes of where and how people read. This is a huge topic, and obviously we can't explore them all, so I'll just focus on a few here. First, retail opportunities. With retail in mind, what better place to put a bookshop than in railway stations? William Marshall had opened the first bookstall at a station as far back as 1841, and there were several firms involved in bookselling at stations, but the most famous by far was W.H. Smith, who opened his first outlet at London's Euston Station in 1848, and he soon added many others all over England. Now, Smith's wasn't like the newsagent chain we know today. For a start, there really was a concentration in stations. And then, besides selling books and newspapers and magazines, from 1860, Smith's also acted as a lending library like Mudi's. For rural readers, having a Smith's at the local station was a real boon, and as Charles Wilson explains in his fascinating history of W.H. Smith's, having started small with a travelling or circulating library on the London and North Western line in 1848, in 1860 Smith's became a national lending service. It was a service that lasted until 1961. And here we have an example of a railway bookstall. Blown up, you can see that the bookstall was also selling newspapers and magazines, but also books, and precisely railway novels. The 3-volume novels of the lending library were ponderous, heavy, hefty. Smith's preferred single-volume reprints. They took up less room on the stall, and they were more convenient for the traveller to carry and to read. But there were other corollaries than the mere size of the book. This is what Mansel has to say about the novels available on the railway bookstall. Look, he notices the small print and cheap paper, but also that these books are ornamented with a highly coloured picture hung out like a signboard to give promise of the entertainment to be had within. The picture, like the book, is generally of the sensation kind, announcing some exciting scene to follow. In other words, like this. Smiths came to prefer books like these, with covers that gave purchasers, without much time to spare, a clue about the contents. Typically, Mansel realizes that time is of the essence, but rather hilariously to my mind, he twists this pretty simple and obvious need into something louche, comparing such novels to tea, coffee, or perhaps a hot toddy, something hot and strong, something that may catch the eye of the hurried passenger and promise temporary excitement to relieve the dullness of the journey. Sounds rather like a casual and rather unpleasant pickup, doesn't it? But there was more to Mansel's point. Not only was he suggesting that railway bookstores, and by 1863 that really did mean Smiths, not only were bookstores peddling these sensational yellowbacks, but he was recalling a common trope of how life had speeded up to such a terrible extent that society had become used to powerful jolts and shocks, and therefore had become addicted to ever stronger sensations, narrative and otherwise. The dram or the dose of some kind of medicine to sedate us. Readers and commuters had become part of what Nicholas Daly called in a very famous article in 1999, a community of nervousness. Drawing on the German critic Walter Benjamin's discussion of Baudelaire, Daly makes what may seem a strange claim that puts the railways at the centre of how people perceived the world. The railways created new sensations, changed the way Victorians sensed the relation between time and space, very dramatically. Benjamin suggests that, somewhat paradoxically, heightened consciousness, low-level anxiety, that is, the subject's defense mechanism against shock, where nervousness or anxiety is, then shock is not. By living on his or her nerves, the modern subject seeks to actually cocoon him or herself from the impact of modernization. What this means in terms of reading on the railways, therefore, is that we need to read something exciting in order to minimize the shock to our senses that we would otherwise feel on the railways. Reading is a kind of anesthetic just like an alcoholic hot toddy, a dose or a dram. Perhaps the radical critic and the conservative aren't quite so far apart as perhaps they'd like to think, but they both have interesting things to make us think about. Of course, there are many train journeys in Henry Dunbar. The suburban ones from Wandsworth, still in 1864 a separate village outside London, to Waterloo. Intercity ones from Waterloo to Southampton. Train journeys to and from small stations like Shorncliffe somewhere in the Midlands, or large stations like Rugby. And then there's the chase on the railway in chapters 42 and 3, Shorncliffe via Derby to Hull. And, of course, there's the train crash in chapter 30. Here's an illustration of a horrific train crash in a London suburb in 1861. There were quite a lot of train crashes, and train crashes were a staple of sensation fiction. They allowed terrific opportunities for identity fraud, as takes place in East Lynne, a very famous and very popular 1861 sensation novel by Mrs. Henry Wood. I thoroughly recommend you read that one. If you're interested in the fascinating topic of railway accidents, and I think you should be, I thoroughly recommend too Paul Fife's wonderful 2015 book on Victorian accidents and the idea of the city. Chapter 5 deals specifically with railway accidents. Paul doesn't mention sensation novels or Henry Dunbar, but his argument has very interesting implications for them, especially in light of what we've heard previously. Now, let's look at the passage describing the crash in Henry Dunbar. Here, as so often, a sensation event is described in a sensation way. As we've seen in previous videos, content and style match in sensation in order to create bodily reactions in readers. Here, a stable point of narrative view is smashed up, not just the train. The syntax, the structure of the sentence, breaks up into a series of fragments. The focus can't hold. The focus can't keep still. Now it's on living children calling for their mothers, on mothers calling for their children, families torn apart, just as the syntax is, and attempting to mend everything as best they can. The brave men who attempt to help, but can't really, just like the army surgeon we encountered in the spasmodic poem by Sidney Dobell in a previous video. As my colleague John Morton's remarked, imagine reading this on a train. It's like watching a plane crash movie on a plane. And yet, if Nicholas Daly and Walter Benjamin are correct, reading such descriptions on a train is meant to be comforting, as by having anxiety about the journey raised in us, it means at least that our train or plane hasn't crashed. We are still reading after all. And by the same token, when we read of the identity fraud perpetrated by Joseph Wilmot, doesn't it remind us that while our identities might be stolen, at least it could be worse? But then perhaps it's not just that we are anxious about the theft of our identities. What if we feel that we are outcasts, not treated as we believe we should be, unjustly treated? In this anonymous, metropolitan world obsessed with wealth, where love and justice and sympathy for our true value are hard to come by, especially if you're poor. Perhaps that's the deepest seated anxiety that the novel seeks to allay. One law for the rich and another for the poor, one justice for the rich and a lack of justice for the poor. Does it allay those anxieties? So, we've already covered the sensation sermon, sensation poetry the sensations of reading and the sensations of transport by the latest technology. What about the sensations of theatre, that other great entertainment industry of the Victorian period? It's interesting that Mansel doesn't mention theatre, as sensation drama had been in the news for a couple of years by the time his piece came out in 1863. I don't want to spend much time on sensation drama, but I do want to bring your attention to the synergy between sensation novels and the stage. The two worked hand in hand, just as novels and short stories today work with film, computer games, and TV shows in order to cross-promote each other. First, what was sensation drama and who is it aimed at? Well, an article from 1861 in The Spectator gives helpful definitions of both. By the look of it, sensation drama was designed to entertain precisely the class of people who would be taking the trains and reading one-volume sensation novels. Those who are inured to jolts and shocks and want something that gives them low-level anxiety which distracts them and comforts them at the same time. They don't want a message or a sermon, simply a distraction, according to the Spectator, at least. You may have read that the first sensation drama was The Colleen Bawn by Dion Boucicault, which opened at the Adelphi Theatre in London on the 10th of September 1860s. Well, you can see in this understanding of dramatic history that the 1860s really are the decade of sensation, and not only dramatic history, but the whole of cultural history. But just as the 1860s sensation novel was preceded by decades of novels that were filled with sensation, so drama was too. Certainly, by the beginning of the 1850s, technology in the theatre was able to produce the spectacular effects that sensation drama was defined by. For, as Michael Diamond explains, in order to be defined as a sensation drama, a play had to have at least one scene that had amazing special effects, including I love this illustration of a rescue from an oncoming underground train. It's a scene from, obviously, a sensation drama from 1868, again by Boucicault. I also like to draw this quotation from Michael Diamond's very readable trade paperback to your attention. Note yet again the complete integration of sensation across all media forms, theatre, novels, and newspapers. A focus on the sensational was absolutely everywhere. It won't surprise you to learn, therefore, that successful sensation novels were adapted for the stage, and of course that included Henry Dunbar. You can see here the closing tableau from a stage version of Henry Dunbar, adapted by Tom Taylor, which played at the Olympic Theatre, London, in 1865. Inevitably, there were significant changes in the play. Here, for example, Joseph Wilmot dies, not only accompanied by Margaret, distraught, as is signalled by her unbound hair, which we can imagine having read the novel, but also in front of Laura, while Clement and Jocelyn, a maidservant, and Detective Carter look on. It's interesting that the published version of the play, that last part of which you can see on the screen in front of you, most of these characters depicted in the illustration of the performed version of the scene aren't supposed to be on stage. Besides Wilmot, only Margaret, Clement, and Carter are down in the text as present. We can, though, imagine all the others rushing on stage to make a very effective tableau at the end. I think the illustration represents the actual performance rather than the written version of the play. You can find the play version online with a very simple search. Tom Taylor's version of Henry Dunbar, interestingly, isn't technically a sensation drama, as it doesn't take up the offer of the special effects, like the train crash or the boat chase, that the novel promises. The plot, too, is much simplified. I think you can see that from the extract in front of you. Several different events in the novel are conflated into this one scene. Carter arrives with Clement at the house of Henry Dunbar, where Margaret, in disguise as a servant, we remember that from the novel, throws Carter off the scent. Immediately, she throws off her disguise before Clement, and whom she just dismisses. He then rushes off, declaring his undying love. Her father totters in, and Margaret and he plan to flee England forever. Margaret's self-sacrifice makes her father think of her dead mother, and it is as if the mother's dead hands came around his throat, for suddenly at the moment of his recollection he can't breathe. He chokes and promptly dies. It's as if he hangs himself, or perhaps the ghost of his dead wife returns to choke him. Something like that. As if seeing heaven before him just before he dies, he believes that God has forgiven him. Everyone then rushes in. Clement shows Margaret that she isn't alone, whatever she says, and then Carter arrives to arrest Wilmot. Too late! His assistant dragging in the criminal major, who evidently hasn't drowned in this version. Margaret has the last word, for she says it's not the law, but God who is Wilmot's real judge. God will ensure that justice will be done, and that all sins will be forgiven. What's interesting is the clearly drawn moral lesson here. Wilmot is in the end forgiven by God. At least that's what we're supposed to understand on the surface. In the review of the play accompanying the illustration, it's just accepted that Mary Braddon is a star author who's popular. The Illustrated Times was much more down market than the Quarterly Review, where Mansel published, and it's got a much more relaxed attitude to sensation novels and to popularity in general, as you can see from the review. The best novelist is the one who manipulates our feelings the most, and that makes them the most popular, and that's what makes them the best. That's it. What strikes me most, though, is that for readers of the Illustrated Times, it's not Henry Dunbar in its 3-volume version that's regarded as popular, though of course it was popular amongst the well-to-do who frequented the circulating libraries. Rather, the article refers to the version serialized in the London Journal called The Outcasts. The final thing is that, according to this article, people seem to go to the theatre with no idea of trying to find out who done it. They aren't interested in acting like detectives in a game of detection. Rather, what the Illustrated Times emphasizes is how the play shows us the price of crime the criminal has to pay. This sounds suspiciously like a moral to me, and I wonder, therefore, if the spectator was correct. It may be that we need to raise our anxiety levels only to have them patted down by the comforts that, no matter how wicked the material world we perceive, the material world of our sensations, stories at least, will in the end resolve in the restoration of justice, even if that justice takes place in an afterlife. Having had our senses roused, they need to be put back asleep, perhaps, by the activation of an older and even archaic archive concerning divine justice. I wonder, is that the game we willingly enter into when we play with sensational detection? I look forward to seeing you for the next video on Henry Dunbar, when we'll be thinking about the key topics proximity and personality and the formulaic.